Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Kishore Mahbubani, who is Dean and Professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. His new book is The Asian Hemisphere. Kishore, welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back here.
One of the themes in your book is the transformation of Asia. Give us a sense of that. I mean, how have things changed in just over the period of your distinguished career and into the present?
Well, I mean, we are clearly entering a new era of world history. And I describe it in two ways. One is, of course, I describe it as the end of the era of Western domination of world history, but not the end of the West, which will remain the single strongest civilization for some time to come. And secondly, you're seeing finally a return of Asia. But the return of Asia, is important to remember, is a return to the norm. Because while the West has been very powerful in the last 200 years, if you look back over the last 2,000 years, from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were consistently China and India. So only in the last 200 years the West has taken off. Now finally the Asian societies have figured out what they need to do to succeed. And as I say in my book, they're implementing the 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And you will see clearly by 2050, as the Goldman Sachs study shows, the 4 largest economies in the world will be number 1, China, number 2, United States of America, number 3, India, number 4, Japan. And not a single European economy will be among the top 4. And that's a huge shift of world history.
Talk a little about the what you call the pillars that made these changes possible. And some of this, if not a lot of it, was learning from the West. So the West has played an important mentor role facilitating this change.
Oh yes, I think the word mentorship is a good word to use. And in fact, one of the more optimistic messages I give in the book is that the Asians, as they emerge, do not want to dominate the West as the West dominated Asia. They actually want to replicate the West and implement its best practices. And you know, it's remarkable how by implementing some fairly simple, straightforward Western policies, how the societies transform themselves. Take China, for example, right? Before they implemented free market economics, when I went to China in 1980 and I went to the barber to have a haircut, he gave me a wonderful haircut, but he took 1 hour. So I said, why do you take 1 hour to do a haircut? He says, well, it doesn't matter whether I do 5 haircuts, 10 haircuts, I get paid the same. So what's the hurry? So, but once you implemented free market economics and you created incentives for people to work, the same people who had been unproductive, for 100 years plus, suddenly became very productive and very dynamic. And for China, the world's most populous country, to have the fastest growing economy in the world for 30 years is as unusual as watching the fattest boy in class win the 100-meter race. And that's because of free market economics.
You throughout the book you have some really interesting statistics, and in one case you quote from the president of China, I guess a press conference that he had in which he went over the figures, and I think they're worth repeating, that in the period 78 to 2004, China has gone from 147.3 billion to 1.6 trillion in its GDP. In foreign trade during that same period, it's gone from 20.6 billion to 1.15 trillion, and that is a growth rate of 16%. The GDP, which I just gave you, has grown 9.4%. And the foreign exchange reserves increased from 167 million to 609.9 billion in 2004 and still growing. So just an extraordinary achievement. And the bottom line here is that Asia is by following free market economics, is creating a middle class.
Oh, enormously. And I'm very glad that you read out those statistics. And by the way, the latest figures are even more impressive. Their GNP is over $2 trillion. Their foreign reserves are $1.3 trillion. I mean, it's amazing. Yes, the huge middle class is being created in both China and India. And this naturally shifts the center of gravity of the world to Asia, because I mean, it is already China, with over 300 million people in the middle class, has a bigger middle class than the United States of America. And most Americans are not even aware of that. And when you create a middle class, the most important thing that happens is that you create a class of what Bob Zoellick once asked China to do, to become a responsible stakeholder. Well, middle-class citizens are almost by definition responsible stakeholders. And so as a consequence, one of the piece of good news that results from the success of Asia is that we are moving to a safer world rather than a more dangerous world. And this is an important point to emphasize to a Western audience, because whenever Western leaders speak, they always begin their speeches by saying we are moving into a more dangerous world, a world that is full of threats. That's not true. Actually, with the rise of the huge numbers of people entering the middle classes in China and India and other societies, we are actually seeing a more peaceful and stable world that is emerging. And this is why the West should welcome the rise of Asia and not try to resist the rise of Asia.
On the middle class, there's another figure I want to quote here. In 2000, 56 million belong to the middle class in China. By 2030, there will be 361 million more than the entire population of the U.S. So, let's just go through some of the things the changes that were sort of in a way. Ways of doing things that were bestowed by the West. You talk about science and technology, a big change there in the way Asia thinks about science and technology.
Oh, yes. In fact, when I was doing some research for the book, I came across a Time magazine cover story on Asia and science. And they quoted a late Nobel Prize winner, Richard Smalley, as saying that even as close as 2010, 90% of all the PhDs in science and technology will be held by Asians. Now, even if it's not 90%, even if it's 85% or 80%, it's quite a remarkable shift, of world history. And the reason why the West was able to go out and conquer and dominate the world is because it mastered science and technology in a spectacular fashion. Today, Asians are discovering that they can do the same also. And indeed, I quote a column from Tom Friedman. He attends a graduation ceremony of a leading university here in America. And when they read out the list of PhD graduates, they're all Asian names, Wang, Li, Tan, or